Hey everyone, it's Lindsay and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here and you like all things true crime, please be sure to like and subscribe and check me out every Friday for a new true crime video. And before I jump into today's case, I just wanted to make a quick announcement that I'm going to start adding in some supernatural videos to my YouTube channel. So if that is something that you are interested in, I should be uploading the first video within the next couple of weeks. So for today's case, I'm going to get into part 2 of the Stayner brothers story. Last week, I talked about Stephen's case and his kidnapping that happened back in 1972. And today I'm going to be talking about his brother Cary and the Yosemite Murders. And if you aren't familiar with Stephen's case, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at part 1. So what we know so far about Cary Stayner is that he grew up with his family in Merced, California, and he was known to be more of a quiet kid. He loved to draw, especially cartoons, so he'd spend a lot of time by himself with his artwork. And in 1972, his younger brother Stephen would go missing. And this would actually be pretty hard on Cary. He would say he would go out at night and wish on a shooting star that his brother would come back. And shockingly enough, almost 8 years later in 1980, his brother Stephen would come back home. So during the time that Stephen was gone, Cary would go on to say that he had felt very neglected by his parents. He would say that Stephen was all they thought about, all they talked about, that they were just very consumed by his disappearance. And then when he returned home in 1980, this would get even worse. And Cary would be quoted as saying, "We never really got along that well after he came back. All of a sudden, Steve was getting all these gifts, getting all this clothing, getting all this attention. I guess I was jealous. I'm sure I was. I was the oldest and all that. Then all of a sudden it's gone. I got put on the back burner, you might say." Like I had said before, Cary was kind of a quiet kid growing up. Even as he got older, he didn't really have many friends. He wasn't really interested in girls. He was pretty much a loner. And he would spend a lot of time driving up to Yosemite by himself. Now, even though the brothers had kind of a strained relationship after Stephen returned home, Cary still loved his brother, and when Stephen died in a motorcycle accident in 1989, many people believed that this would be the start of the chain of tragic events that would follow. Now, Cary had already been dealing with some emotional and mental issues when Stephen had died, but not long after that, his uncle Jesse, who he had been living with, would be shot and killed in a home invasion. So Cary's life was just really starting to unravel now, and he would end up having a couple of mental breakdowns. In 1991, he would try to commit suicide with carbon monoxide, and then a couple years after that, he would tell a friend that he wanted to drive his truck through his place of work and kill his boss and everyone else in the building, and then torch the place on fire. So Cary had just seemed really lost. He had no direction, he had no goals. I don't even think he was working at this point. He just didn't know what to do with his life. So in 1997, he would find some solitude when he would move up to Yosemite. And Yosemite was a place that he had loved and frequented most of his life. And he would even end up getting a job as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge in El Portal. And El Portal was a small town just outside the entrance to the Yosemite National Park. So Cary had worked at the lodge for about 2 years when on February 15th, 1999, 3 women who had been visiting the park would go missing. Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie Sund, and Julie's best friend, who was actually visiting from Argentina, Silvina Peloso. So Carol and the girls would fly out from Eureka, California to San Francisco, and Carol would drive Julie to a cheerleading competition in Stockton. and then they would drive out to enjoy Yosemite for a few days. And on the 15th of February, the girls would spend most of the day touring the park, and then they would end up having a dinner at the hotel restaurant and then renting a movie for them to watch later on in their room. Now, the park was pretty much desolate this time of year. There weren't really many visitors. Most people had gone home by now. And the girls' hotel room was actually as far as you could get from the hotel and restaurant. And they had rented a red Pontiac for their trip, and this pretty much set alone in the parking lot. Later on in the evening, the girls would start to settle in. They would change into their pajamas and sit down to watch the movie they had rented, Jerry Maguire. Now, Cary Stayner had noticed that their car was pretty much the only one in that parking lot area.
As I watched, there was a red car in the 500 building all by itself. The window was open, the curtain was open, and I can see inside that there's two young women and the mother and young man.
So this was pretty much a green light to go ahead and act out something that he had been wanting to do for years. So Cary would knock on the girl's door and he would tell them that he was maintenance and that there was some sort of leak and he needed to get into their room to check it out. Now, at first, Carol would tell him no, that the girls were in their pajamas, they were watching a movie, but Cary would persist, and he would go on to tell her that, if he couldn't figure out where the leak was coming from, he would have to move everyone to another room. So Carol ended up letting him in. And when Cary first got into the room, he would go into the bathroom to look at the so-called leak, and when he came out a couple minutes later, he would put a gun up to Carol and tell her that he wanted her car keys and money. So after Carol had handed him her keys, he would put the younger girls into the bathroom. He would then come out where he would bind Carol up with duct tape and end up strangling her with a rope. He would then take her out of the hotel room and put her body into her rental car. He would then go back into the hotel where he would pull both girls out of the bathroom and sexually assault them. He would then bring Sylvina back into the bathroom where he would strangle her as well and then put her body into the trunk along with Carol. Now, Julie was still alive at this point, and Cary would go back in to get her.
It was getting pretty late, probably 5 o'clock or so in the morning. I told Julia we had to get someplace to go, and I went to Harlem. So I put her in the car, her hands were duct taped in front of her, I wrapped a pink blanket around her, and I just drove. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was going to do.
So Cary would eventually come to this remote overlook called Vista Point.
I took Julie out of the car, I carried her down the pathway, and I laid out the blanket, and I guess I knew what I was going to do, was I had the knife with me. And I slit her throat.
He would end up carrying her down this pathway in front of the reservoir where he would lay her down on this blanket and end up slitting her throat. He would end up leaving her body there and taking off in the red Pontiac with Carol and Sylvina's bodies still in the trunk. Now, his plans had originally been to dump the car in a reservoir. However, it had gotten stuck in this wooded area, so he would just end up taking off. And he would walk about a mile or two to Sierra Village, where he would call a cab back to Yosemite. So meanwhile, Carol's son's husband had been waiting at the San Francisco airport, but the girls would never show up. And Carol was known to just be very scheduled and organized. So the fact that she didn't show up to meet her husband was definitely a red flag. And her husband would end up calling the police immediately. Now, everyone had thought that maybe they had gotten into a car accident. The weather in Yosemite at this time of year was pretty bad. It was always snowy and icy. No one had ever really assumed that any foul play was involved. So a huge search would be formed to look for the women. And in fact, they would say that this was the largest search that they had ever put together. Carol's husband and her parents would be handing out flyers to everyone, and Sylvina's parents would even fly in from Argentina. Everyone was just overcome with worry, just praying and hoping that these women would be found safe. So the police would start interviewing the staff at Cedar Lodge, and this would include Cary Stayner. However, Cary was very helpful and cooperative. He didn't seem flustered at all. He had answered all of their questions. He let them into the rooms when they were looking for evidence, and he would even tell them the story of his brother Stephen. And with no previous criminal records, the police really had no reason to believe that Cary was guilty of anything. So it was about a month later, on March 19th, that they would finally get a big break in the case. A hunter would be walking in the woods about 60 miles from Cedar Lodge when he would come across a badly burned car. Now, he was able to read the license plate, so he would call this into the California Highway Patrol, and they were able to verify that, in fact, it was Carol's rental car. And when the FBI agents arrived on the scene the following day, they would find 2 charred bodies in the trunk of the car. And because the bodies were so unrecognizable, they would need to obtain dental records in order to identify the bodies. And ultimately, the records would be able to confirm that the bodies did belong to Carol and Sylvina. The families were absolutely devastated, and the nation was completely shocked that something like this had happened in Yosemite.
I knew from the very beginning that my girl was there.
How?
I don't know. Don't ask me. Just felt it.
Her mother's intuition was sadly correct. It was Sylvina in the trunk of that car. Sylvina, along with Carol's son.
As a father, I feel terrible. I'm supposed to die. Excuse me.
But Julie's body was still missing, so her family had hopes that maybe she was still alive. Maybe somebody was out there holding her hostage. So the police would start frantically searching for her, and they had searched for her for about a week when they would receive a clue in the mail. So they had received this note with a hand-drawn map, and the map had shown this reservoir called Don Pedro with a road leading up to it. And at the top were the words, "We had fun with this one." So the police would get a cadaver dog out to this area, and almost immediately Julie's son's body was discovered. Now, Yosemite would remain quiet for a while. People were just really scared. I mean, even locals weren't visiting the park. However, after about 5 months in the summer of '99, Yosemite would start to return back to normal. Tourists would start coming back, and the FBI believed that they had the killers responsible in custody. These were 2 half-brothers that had previous criminal records. Meanwhile, Cary Stayner was still working at the Cedar Lodge, knowing that he had gotten away with triple murder. So on July 21st, Cary would end up going for a ride in his International Scout out to an area called Foresta, a place that he had been multiple times because he had believed to have seen Bigfoot there. He would drive down this back road that actually connects Cedar Lodge with Yosemite. So typically when he would go visit, he would drive to the end of this road where there's this beautiful meadow. However, this specific day when he got out of his car, he would notice 26-year-old Joey Armstrong outside of her cabin. The green cabin had been leased by the Yosemite Institute, where Joey had worked as a naturalist. Her job was to teach the younger children about the nature of Yosemite. And Joey's mom would go on to say that she would ask her daughter if she was nervous about living there because of the 3 women that had been murdered months prior. But Joey said that she had felt pretty comfortable knowing that the suspects were in jail. And the day that Cary had noticed Joey outside, she was actually packing her truck for a trip that she had planned with some friends. And Cary would say he would watch her walk in and out of the cabin while he threw rocks in the creek. And he would say he thought that she was alone, so he would go over to his truck and get out his bag. Now, this wasn't a typical bag, this was his murder kit. And inside his murder kit was a gun, a knife, and some duct tape. So once Cary got out his bag, he would go over to Joey and just start making conversation. And the whole time that he was talking to her, he was actually glancing over her shoulder to make sure that she was actually alone. And once he was able to confirm this, he would take out his gun and put it up to her head. And Joey was freaking out at this point, and he would guide her into the house, into the back bedroom, where he would start binding her up with duct tape. Now, Joey would start fighting back, and I don't think that Cary realized how strong that Joey actually was. So he would end up picking her up and putting her into the back seat of his truck. So once he had started driving, Joey continued to fight. I mean, she was moving around and jumping around so much that she was actually able to fling herself out of the truck window. Cary would have to stop the truck and physically chase her down. However, once he caught up to her, he would end up using his knife to slit her throat. So when Joey doesn't show up to meet her friends for their trip, they would really start to worry, and of course they would end up calling the cops. And in light of everything that had happened over the spring, they would immediately start searching for her. They would go down to her cabin, where they would find a few things out of place, broken sunglasses, and there was just this debris all over the floor. But it wasn't until they started searching the stream outside that they would find the decapitated body of Joey Armstrong. And they would end up finding her head several feet away. This time, however, Cary had left behind a ton of evidence, including tire tracks. And somebody had actually seen his truck driving down that back road and would call this into authorities. So the police would end up looking for Cary so that they could follow up on the tip, and he would actually deny that he was in that area on that day. And he would even let them search his truck. They would also confiscate his backpack, but nothing ever really came of it. So Cary was really starting to feel the pressure at this point. He knew it was just a matter of time before the police had figured everything out. So he would end up packing up all of his things, and he would end up fleeing to a nudist colony called Laguna del Sol. And when the police had realized that Cary never made it to work the following day, they would end up issuing a be on the lookout alert. So once Cary had gotten to Laguna del Sol, he would end up pitching a tent outside and then visiting the nearby bar for a drink. He would strike up a conversation with this woman where he would end up telling her that things weren't going so well for him. Now, when this woman had realized that she had seen him on the news, she would immediately call the police.
Things are not so well now. I've decided to pack up my stuff, in fact, and I'm headed north.
So Agent Jeffrey Reineck would head out to Laguna del Sol to meet up with another agent to find Cary. And these agents really had no idea what Cary had done. They had just assumed that they were picking him up to question him because he was a witness. So the agents would end up finding Cary sitting in the restaurant, and when Cary would see the agents walk in, he would immediately put his hands up. He didn't resist. He didn't ask them why they were there. He pretty much knew that he had been caught, and he was actually very cooperative with the officers. So Cary would end up taking the 2-hour ride to the FBI offices in Sacramento with Agent Reineck. So the two would end up actually having multiple conversations during this ride and would even form kind of a small bond. And I think this bond is actually what helped Cary in his confessions. and Reineck would actually say that the drive was a pleasant one. Now, the agents and Cary would get back to the FBI offices, still not really knowing what Cary had done. So they thought, let's just get a pizza, we'll have some lunch together, maybe break the ice, and then we can try to figure out how to start questioning him. And that's when Cary dropped a bombshell. Cary would tell them that he could bring closure to the case and that he could give them details to Joey's murder. However, he had one condition in which he'd talk. He wanted the agents to bring him a stack of child pornography, or in Cary's words, pictures of little girls. Now, Reineck was really stunned by Cary's request, and obviously he knew that this could never happen. But he also didn't want to ruin his chances of getting a full confession. So he would tell Cary that he would do what he could to get this to him. And this seemed good enough to Cary because Cary slowly started confessing to the murder of Joey Armstrong. So Cary would go on to describe when he first saw her and how he tied her up and put her into the back of his car and killed her. And the whole time that he was talking about this, he was just emotionless. The one agent said it sounded like he was just reading a soup label.
It seemed like she was alone. I had a backpack, a small green backpack. In the backpack I had a .22 revolver. She stepped up on the porch and was talking to me, and then she turned around. So I pulled out the gun and put it to her head. She turned around and freaked out. Took her to the back corner of the house, to a bedroom. I duct taped her and gagged her. She resisted quite a bit. I didn't hit her or anything. I just used threats and the gun to subdue her. As I was trying to duct tape her hands behind her back, she kept fighting me. And as I was driving, she started going crazy and just jumping all over the place in the back of the truck. And I couldn't really control her. And she fell off through the window on the road right in front of the barn. I slammed the truck in the park and jumped out. And she got up off the ground and started running.
What did you do then?
I took a knife in my back pocket and I slit her throat.
The investigators told me that I should be very proud of her, that because she fought, there was a lot of evidence.
Now, at this point, they were still unsure that he was involved in the murder of the other three women. However, Agent Reineck, who had formed this bond with Cary, would use this to his advantage. He would tell Cary that, he was doing great and he would feel so good to get it all out. And he was just being very non-judgmental and very patient with him. And this tactic seemed to work because after a few moments of silence, yet again, Cary would be confessing to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. And he would even end up telling them where he had thrown the knife and duct tape he had used on them. And just when they thought they had pretty much heard everything, Cary would go on to drop yet another bombshell. He would go on to admit that those three women were not who he had originally intended on killing that night. See, Cary Stayner had this girlfriend who had 2 young daughters, and these girls just loved Cary.
My name is Lena, and I grew up in a small town right outside Yosemite National Park. My sister and I met Cary in 1998. My mom was a waitress at the Cedar Lodge, where Cary was a maintenance man and lived above the restaurant. They were in a relationship. He was warm, like a big teddy bear, a safe person to be around. We were excited when Cary would come over. He would buy us a new Beanie Baby almost every time we saw him, because that was pretty big in the 90s. My sister and I would be walking up the driveway and we'd see Cary Stayner coming up in his Scout and we'd jump in the truck and he'd give us a ride up to our house. I loved him a lot. I don't know if he knew how much I did. He was a happy part of our life. Such a happy part that turned into such a dark part of our life.
And so the day after Valentine's Day, Cary's plans were to kill his girlfriend and rape and kill her 2 daughters. However, a friend of his girlfriend's happened to show up at the house that evening, so this would pretty much ruin any plans that he had had. So when he had gotten back to the lodge, he was still in that mindset. He was still just very much ramped up. He would try to relax and walk around the property, but this is when he would come across the 3 women and decide to carry out his plan. Now, Cary would eventually end up sharing that since the time he was about 7 years old, he would fantasize about tying up and killing women. So the defense would argue that Cary was actually insane at the time of the murders and that he had had a long history of mental illness. But the jury wouldn't agree that this should affect any of the time that he was sentenced. And between his confession and all the forensic evidence, in 2002, Cary Stayner would be found guilty of all 4 murders in the first degree and would be sentenced to life. He currently sits on death row at the San Quentin State Prison. Now, a lot of people have their own theories and opinions on this case, and I know that some people believe that what had happened to Stephen severely affected Cary, and that when Stephen and Cary's uncle died, that this pretty much set him off. And others believe that Cary just did this for attention because of the neglect from his parents, and then all the media attention that Stephen had gotten and the movie that they had made about him. Now we can never really say for sure, but if Stephen had never been kidnapped, would Cary still have killed those women? Now, in my opinion, I do believe that Cary was mentally ill. Do I think that what had happened to Stephen affected Cary? Yes, but I don't believe that that's what made him a murderer. I mean, he had had these fantasies from the time that he was a little boy. And I think that eventually, regardless of what happened in his life, he would have killed somebody. I think that he just had this rage in him and he couldn't help himself anymore. I mean, he had these impulsive thoughts that he just can't get rid of. And he has even said that if no one had stopped him, he would have continued to kill. So I'm really curious to know what you guys think about this case. Do you think that what happened to Stephen has any connection to Cary becoming the Yosemite Killer? So just drop a comment below or head on over to my Instagram and let me know what you think. And if you have any cases that you would like me to cover, send an email to lindsaymichelle.truecrime@gmail.com. So that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful week and I will see you next time.